This video was made possible by Wix. If you are ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics to try out one of their premium plans right now. In war, there's only one rule: win. Well, actually, that's not true, or at least not true anymore. In the aftermath of World War II, 196 nations ratified in whole, or with some reservations, 2 additional treaties to the Geneva Conventions, detailing the basic rights of wartime prisoners, establishing protections for the wounded and sick, and protecting civilians caught on a war zone. The conventions also laid down the framework for the international banning of certain weapons of war, which we'll look at today in this episode of the Infographics Show, Top 10 Banned Weapons of War. War is dirty business, and in the aftermath of the First World War, the nations of the world moved to limit the scope of its destructive impact. Horrified by the mass casualties inflicted by chemical gas attacks, in 1925, at the initiative of the United States, France, and Poland, the League of Nations drafted the Protocol for the Prohibition of the Use in War of Asphyxiating, Poisonous, or Other Gases, and of Bacteriological Methods of Warfare. In essence, international law forbade the use of chemical or biological weapons in war. Since then, other weapons have been added to that list, all with the intent purpose of limiting human suffering or damage to the Earth itself. Without further ado, here are the top 10 banned weapons of war. Number 10, mustard gas. First synthesized in 1822, it wasn't until 1860 that the dangerous properties of mustard gas were documented. As a chemical weapon and dubbed the king of the battle gases, mustard gas is surprisingly the least lethal of all the various chemicals that were used in World War I, and it's estimated that only about 1 to 5% of the people exposed to it were killed. Mustard gas's real power lay in the terror it could sow among enemy troops, as well as the incapacitating effect exposure had on unprotected soldiers. Inhaled into the lungs, it could be fatal, but while a gas mask would protect from inhalation, there was nothing soldiers could do to protect their exposed skin. The effects of exposure were not immediate, but within hours, the skin would begin to blister, specifically in moist areas such as the armpits and genitals. As the blisters popped, they would often become infected, which is where mustard gas became one of the most lethal gas weapons ever used. Infection typically kills more soldiers in war than actual combat does. Worst of all, exposure created sensitivity, and further exposure at even lower doses would cause a reaction. Number 9, chlorine gas. Another of the gases used extensively in World War I, it was first deployed by the Germans at Ypres on the 22nd of April 1915. Though an 1899 treaty had forbidden the use of gas in war, the Germans sidestepped the wording in the treaty by releasing the gas from canisters, not projectiles as outlined in the treaty. Planning to release the gas from their own lines, the Germans waited until the wind turned towards the French forces and then let the heavier-than-air gas drift across no man's land and sink into the French trenches. The attack was successful, and 100 French troops were killed. Chlorine gas irritates the eyes, nose, lungs, and throat, and in high enough concentrations can fill the lungs and kill by asphyxiation. Though seen as a horrific weapon of war, the Germans argued that the intent was to actually shorten the length of the war and thus limit overall suffering. Number 8, phosgene gas. Mustard gas may have been dubbed the king of the battle gases, but when it comes to sheer lethality, no other gas used in World War I could top phosgene. Colorless and smelling like moldy hay, not an uncommon smell in the trenches of Europe, most troops did not realize they had even been exposed to phosgene until it was too late. A slow-acting gas, victims' lungs would fill with fluid, and after a day or two would suffocate to death. No treatment existed at the time, and the best a medic could do is make victims comfortable. Although the Germans were the first to use phosgene, it became the weapon of choice for the Allies and would ultimately be responsible for 85% of the 1.2 million casualties of chemical warfare during World War I. Number 7, nerve gas. In 2017, 100 people, including children, were killed in a nerve gas attack in Syria by pro-government forces, with hundreds left injured. An independent investigation later identified the culprit as sarin gas, a highly lethal nerve agent. Banned by international treaty, nerve agents are some of the most lethal forms of chemical warfare weapons and work by disrupting the ability for nerves in the body to transmit chemical messages between each other. Colorless, tasteless, and odorless, the first sign of exposure is uncontrolled drooling from the mouth, followed by foaming. Nausea and stomach cramps follow, along with uncontrollable urination and diarrhea. Eventually, the victim's lungs become paralyzed, leaving them unable to breathe. Number 6, plastic landmines. Landmines have been around for centuries, albeit in very crude fashion. Some of the first ever used were by the Chinese during the Song dynasty against an assault by the Mongols. Filling cast iron cannonball shells with gunpowder, they had an extremely long fuse which had to be lit by hand by brave ambushers just hundreds of feet away from the enemy. Modern landmines are completely autonomous and can vary in tripping mechanisms from pressure-sensitive triggers to tripwires. With the advent of the metal detector, landmines were designed using plastic in order to avoid detection. However, they were quickly banned internationally due to the difficulty in locating fragments via X-ray by treating physicians. This would cause prolonged suffering and was ultimately seen as inhumane. Number 5. Biological weapons. Though around for nearly the entire time that man has waged war against itself, biological weapons were only recently banned under international law. Most biological weapons take the form of weaponized disease agents such as bacteria and viruses, but they can also include fungi, toxins, and rickettsia, parasites that normally affect arthropods but can be deadly in humans. Modern conventions don't just protect people from biological weapons, but actually prohibit their use against plants and animals as well, preventing nations from engineering plagues that can wipe out a nation's livestock or crops and thus creating famine, which is seen as unnecessary human suffering. Number 4. Flamethrowers. Made famous for their use in World War II and Vietnam, flamethrowers were the answer to combating enemies entrenched inside fortified bunkers or underground tunnels. In these confined spaces, flamethrowers can actually be more lethal by sucking the oxygen out of the atmosphere than from their actual flames. While technically not illegal, their use around civilian areas has been banned due to the incredible damage they can inflict on infrastructure and their inability to be properly aimed. Number 3. Napalm. Another weapon made famous by the Vietnam War, napalm was actually developed in 1942 at Harvard University. As a mixture of a gelling agent and some kind of fuel such as gasoline, napalm was originally designed to be used as an incendiary device against buildings, but was later primarily used as an anti-personnel weapon. As the sticky substance sticks to the skin, it produces severe burns, and sharing in many of the same characteristics as a flamethrower, it can also make it impossible for individuals to breathe. Though not outlawed for military use, its use in civilian population centers is illegal, once again due to the propensity for incredible property damage and inability to fully control its effects. Number 2. Poisoned bullets. Early bullets weren't very accurate or powerful, so militaries around the world would spike them with small amounts of poison or fecal matter. While not adding any immediate lethality, a poisoned bullet could deliver toxic compounds deep into the body and result in serious infection that would set in long after a battle took place. In modern projectiles, the addition of poison would be largely pointless as well, as modern bullets are already devastatingly powerful. Because of the lack of immediate lethality and suffering caused long after a conflict is over, poison bullets have long been banned by international law. And finally, number 1. Dirty bombs. Nuclear weapons are bad enough, and the international community has been unsuccessfully trying to ban them since their inception. Nuclear weapons are primarily designed to destroy military or civilian targets, yet to achieve maximum explosive impact, they are detonated high above their target where the pressure wave can spread. This has the side effect of causing most of the radiation released to be harmlessly blasted up into space or dispersed over a very wide area, limiting its effect. A dirty bomb, however, is a device that is designed primarily to create radiological fallout rather than kill outright, with the goal of poisoning land, sea, and air for a very long time. A regular nuclear weapon can be converted into a dirty bomb by simply programming it to detonate at ground level, thus creating massive plumes of radioactive debris and irradiating dozens of square miles. However, other devices, such as a cobalt bomb, can be detonated high up in the air and produce tremendous amounts of radioactive fallout. These dirty or salted bombs have long been banned due to the long-lasting and catastrophic damage they do to large swaths of the environment. Man has waged war since his inception, but it's only in the last few centuries that we've begun to try and limit the scope of the destruction that we inflict on each other. As technology progresses and makes more apocalyptic and destructive weapons available, perhaps it's a sign of hope that even the most embittered enemies, such as the Soviet Union and the USA, have abided by these international laws. Maybe one day we can even move to outlaw war altogether. You know what we think should be illegal? Terrible websites. And with Wix available right now to help you make an amazing website today, there's no excuses. Wix's hosting is cheap and affordable, but if you really want to kick it up a notch, their subscription services offer technical support and unlimited bandwidth. Check out the link in the description or go to wix.com/go/infographics and get started building the website of your dreams. So, what's the most horrific weapon of war you've ever heard of? Can we ever truly put our warmongering ways behind us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called Moab, the Mother of All Bombs. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!